Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to go you further about our US civil rights topic. And in this video, we're going to really wrap things up now with the 1950s and get into our final big change that happened, which concerns transport, how segregation was changed on public transport, both across the northern states and the southern states. And we're going to go through two very important cases to really understand this as well. If you haven't already, do make sure you check out the previous videos where we've also gone up to the education, how education was changed, Brown versus Topeka, and the impact of the federal government, their actions, or maybe inaction, that led to the formation of what is now becoming an official civil rights movement. Do remember as well that this video is catered towards the student level, so we're going to be exploring some key knowledge, and the video will be dedicated to practicing historical skills along the way. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So as said, we're going to be looking at how transport has changed now, a big development for the social lives of African Americans in society. So we're going to need a bit of background first, what the current situation is with it, and then of course how it's going to change now we're into the 1950s. So segregation on public transport actually already underwent some changes before the 1950s. So we're actually going to explore the case of Irene Morgan to start things off. And this was actually back just after the Second World War in 1946. The NAACP, a group we should be very familiar with by now, have been accepting and arguing other cases regarding public transport before, and Irene Morgan was the first major one they had success with. Now, this, of course, concerned interstate travel, so it's where people were traveling from the states, and of course, especially the northern states, into southern states and vice versa. The case of Irene Morgan went very well for the NAACP, and they actually resulted in a big victory with the US Supreme Court, and actually came to a big decision that segregating interstate bus lines violated federal laws. However, as I said there, this only applied to interstate travel, and the sad truth is that the overwhelming majority of bus journeys were taken within a state's own borders, so therefore many buses, especially in southern states, remained very, very segregated. And this actually had a lot of impact in those southern states especially, and one case actually coming to the fore in Alabama in the city of Montgomery. Here, there was a clear law in place, a states' rights law, which the federal government were not impeding on, which was that African American passengers had to sit at the back of a bus, even when there were clearly spaces available in the white seats. So you imagine you have a long bus, and so at the front of the bus, the whites tended to sit, whereas at the back, the African Americans had to sit. And the law in place was is that whenever a white person came onto the bus, the African Americans had to move their rows back and sit right at the back and were much more cramped and so forth. It's also worth noting the actual bus drivers were quite rude in enforcing this law. They would be quite racially abusive towards them, verbally abusive, and this was not helped by the fact that, especially in southern states, the only drivers that were allowed to be were white drivers. In Montgomery, especially, there were no cases of African Americans being allowed to be bus drivers. And this has been the case since 1946, despite that Supreme Court ruling. The states' rights in the South, again with that Dixiecrat majority, are still pushing, still insisting that although the federal law has made one decision, their states have to do it differently. And again, because it only says interstate travel, they still do things their own way. So again, that states and federal rights dynamic is still very much at play. Then we get to 1955, we get to June time, and a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, she's a student in Montgomery, and she actually was handcuffed, arrested, and forcibly removed from a public bus when she tried to refuse to give up her seat for a white man. Colvin was an active member in the NAACP. She was part of the youth council, and she knew Rosa Parks, who was serving as an advisor for the youth council group in Montgomery. When Parks heard this, she was very angry at the news that an African American student, a girl, had been forcefully arrested and had been removed from the bus in this manner and publicly humiliated, despite simply wanting to sit in a different part of the bus than was typically allowed. And so who is Rosa Parks? Well, I'd say she's a long-standing member of the NAACP, but it's worth us knowing a bit of background about her and who exactly this woman is. Now, Rosa Parks was born in Montgomery, Alabama, and she actually comes from mixed race descendancy. However, despite this, she still suffered a lot of racism during her youth. For instance, in the 1910s and 1920s, she lived in fear that every night she would have to leave her home and run away with her family in case the Ku Klux Klan ever tried to attack them. Because again, we should remember way back with our lesson with Woodrow Wilson, how racist and how out of touch he was with the southern states and the problems they were facing there, and how he didn't really do much to stop the KKK and their attempts at illegal lynching to occur for African Americans in the South. And so she grew up with that kind of culture, and so she was very inspired. She wanted to make a change when she got to her adult years. But it's worth noting, she actually married Raymond Parks, who was a founding member of the Montgomery wing of the NAACP back in 1931. And so when she joins the NAACP in 1942, she's very much about making a difference, making a stand for change and progress for the African American community. And she believed the biggest way to do that was with suffrage, by getting to jury, clear lawful progress, and securing the right to vote for the African Americans who were unable to vote in the South because they lacked the ability to do so because of things like literacy tests and the poll tax. And so when we get to the 1950s, she becomes very inspired by the NAACP's lawful success in the Supreme Court, especially Brown v. Topeka, which you remember that from last lesson, concerning progress in education, related to the idea of that case, and of course Little Rock, a clear point where it comes into practice. And so why is this important? Well, because she decides to make a stand in December 1955 for the case of civil rights after what had happened to Claudette Colvin. So on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks is on a bus and she's in the front row, where most of the African Americans are actually sitting at the time. However, a white man following stop boards the bus. The white bus driver then insists that everyone in Rosa Parks' row has to move back and go to the very back of the bus because a white man has to have her seat instead. Although all the other African Americans did so, Rosa Parks refused, and as a response, the bus was then stopped, police were called, and she was forcibly taken away and arrested. It became a full-blown thing. She was taken to court, she was found guilty on December 5th, and she was fined $10, a fair bit of money at that time. And another consequence as well is that Rosa Parks actually lost her job as a seamstress in the Montgomery department store as a problem with it. And it also meant she faced backlash in her family. Her husband, Raymond Parks, was forced out of his job at a US Army base. And the pair of them did receive countless death threats from white people. However, she became quite famous as a consequence of all of this, and the NAACP got wind of what had happened and wanted to make a stand on her behalf. Parks fitted a certain profile for them, an image that would look great for them in the media. She was female, she was decent, quite respectable, she was a married woman, and had been a hard-working campaigner for over 10 years by now. And so they decided to commit to direct action. And the person they chose to lead this case was a young preacher from Georgia called Martin Luther King. The NAACP rallied the African Americans in the community and they organized a boycott of the buses using assistance from local colleges and African American churches. Hence, Martin Luther King was brought in as a 26-year-old Baptist minister to help lead the boycott as well. We're going to say a lot in future videos about Martin Luther King. This is the first case where he comes to the fore and becomes a key figure in the action. Martin Luther King did a lot in terms of media presence. He did many speeches, he got himself in TV interviews, and he really spread the word to make sure this wasn't just contained in Montgomery, but people knew throughout America this was occurring and happening. Concurrently, the NAACP were fighting the case for Rosa Parks in the courts to get a law passed where the states would have to rule that segregated transport was illegal and unconstitutional in every state, not just the ones in the North or on interstate travel. By boycotting the buses, the African Americans were refusing to use them for transport, they were refusing to pay for them, they were walking everywhere. They were walking without using transport at all to get to work, to get to any of their destinations. People were, of course, car sharing, volunteering to share their vehicles, and there was even actions from the African American churches to build and replace new footwear for them so they could travel everywhere easier, despite all the walking that they were having to do. The white community retaliated quite firmly, and there were cases where places like Martin Luther King's home were even being firebombed by pro-segregation racists. Boycotters were even physically attacked by whites in the streets. However, something that really became very important for Martin Luther King Jr. was this idea of whether, while doing direct action, they were going to be peaceful. Despite being attacked, they were not going to retaliate. And this plays massively into his religious beliefs that he was buying into and using as the campaign went on. After a full year of this occurring and 50,000 African Americans partaking in Montgomery alone, there was finally a significant turning point, a significant victory. The white Montgomery Citizens Council, who have been organizing this opposition using arrest and intimidation to frighten the likes of King and the protesters away, had failed. If anything, what they had done with their exposure in the media is actually only increase support for the African American community because of the danger and damage they were putting them in. This mass direct action eventually built lots of success, and we found that the large scale protests of the movement had led to the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Browder v. Gale that in November 1956, Montgomery would have to fall in and desegregate all of its transport services and authorize all African American citizens and passengers to sit anywhere they chose to on the buses and could not be forced to sit at the back as they had done the previous year. This had been a massive and significant success for the NAACP and Martin Luther King. This became the birth of what was going to be known as the Civil Rights Movement, where grassroots activism, the masses of African Americans could band together and force change to occur by uniting and using their presence in the media to improve support for them across America. It made people in America very aware how racist, how unequal, how unjust their lives were in the South. This also led, especially for King, for him to become a new and successful leader for the civil rights movement, and he actually formed the Southern Christianship Leadership Conference, a group we'll be talking more about once we get into the 1960s in our following lessons. On a note to Rosa Parks, though, her life, ironically, despite all this progress that had happened, didn't really improve so much. She still faced a lot of backlash from the white community, and she and her husband Raymond actually chose to leave Alabama and move to Detroit in 1957 to escape all the death threats and harassment they were facing from the white community. So, as we reach the end of the 1950s, what progress has actually occurred for African Americans in this decade? And I think it's fair to say quite a lot has happened for them in this time span. For instance, Truman has started with Executive Order 9981 for there to be full integration of the United States Armed Forces. While he didn't finish it, Eisenhower carried this on and had fully integrated the armed forces by 1954. So we see a big action from Eisenhower and the federal government to get involved. We also see that he, of course, appoints Earl Warren, and the Warren Court is established as quite liberal in the Supreme Court, and they make some unanimous passings for support in terms of civil rights, particularly Brown v. Topeka for ending school segregation, and Browder v. Gale, which ends transport segregation across all states, not just those in the North. We also see federal action really getting involved in the southern states, particularly at Little Rock in Arkansas. Eisenhower, despite reluctant at first, finally sends the 101st Airborne in to make sure integration occurs for those 9 African American students. And we even see some more civil rights legislation actually passed. For instance, in 1957 and 1960, there are some improvements for ensuring the African Americans can try and get the ballot for their vote and finally achieve suffrage at last. However, he faced resistance with this. Despite his efforts and despite the Supreme Court's passings to try and improve suffrage for them, the Dixiecrats still resisted to try and ensure that it could not fully happen in the southern states. For instance, Eisenhower famously said that he wanted the 900,000 African Americans in Mississippi to be able to register to vote. However, only 7,000 of them were able to do so, and it's because the Southern Democrats were fighting against the bill and ensuring it was not going to be enforced. Even Eisenhower himself did not really understand what the bill really meant and did not fight to keep it intact, keep it secure as time was passing. Although, as Martin Luther King Jr. counted, at least a bill had passed and at least a act had been secure in 1957 and 1960, and this was better than having nothing at all. And this is where we get into the debate now. There seems to have been a lot of de jure progress, but in terms of de facto progress, where it's really tangible and it's actually visible and present in African American lives, it's not really that visible. Again, for those Civil Rights Act that were passed, only 3% of African American voters actually gain the ability to vote from it, which again isn't really a massive amount. We see some big reluctance from the federal government. Eisenhower is still quite passive. He only gets involved in Little Rock reluctantly when diplomacy completely fails. And even despite getting involved there, Forbes just decides to close the school anyway the following year. So by the end of 1960, there's really no true progress that's happened in that community, despite all the de jure progress with Brown v. Topeka. But there is some shining light that is coming about for this in 1960. We're seeing absolute proof, like in the 1940s when Philip Randolph campaigned with the Brothers and Sleeping Car Porters to get federal action passed under Roosevelt. Direct action and a combination of civil rights protests from this growing civil rights movement is getting some key change in place, particularly Browder v. Gale. And despite his flaws, Eisenhower was working to meet with these African American communities. He actually famously met Randolph and King, the first president to do so in the White House with any African American leaders for many decades. So perhaps we have the coming together of something here. Perhaps the civil rights progress is finally going to be secured and can finally come to the fore. Will this indeed be the case? Well, that's what we're going to find out when we get into the 1960s, which for many will be the defining decade of civil rights. We've had much progress occurred on the de jure level, but it's time we see some de facto, some tangible progress happen for the African American communities. As always, make sure you like and comment and subscribe how you're finding the series. Give me your answer as well. Do you think there's been more de jure progress than de facto progress at this time? Or is this quite a lot for the African Americans? If we go back and look at the state of things before the Second World War, in this roughly 20-year time span, have they actually gained quite a lot? But despite saying that, perhaps the answer is they still haven't gained enough, and more progress must indeed happen to right the wrongs of the inequality they're facing in their nation. So with that said, I hope you found this video insightful. Do make sure you check out the following videos for more history with Sire to learn more about civil rights. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.